My name is Shlomi Ron. I'm a co-founder at the Visual Storytelling Institute based here in sunny Miami, Florida. A little bit about what we do. We help marketers like you, or if you're an entrepreneur, rise above the communication noise with our personalized visual storytelling programs so you can connect better with your audience, empower their lives, and grow faster your company. So as you could imagine, we meet with a lot of clients. We run a few workshops, and we get a lot of questions about, how can I really find and own my business story? And a kind of a follow-up question to that, they ask us, what are the secret ingredients to make a good business story? So with that, we thought it would be a great idea to devote a whole show for just, the power of story. So I have the great pleasure today to speak with Diana Yazidjian. She's a business storytelling expert with DFY Consulting. She's coming to us all the way from, as she said, -4, I guess, Montreal in Canada. And Diana has an extensive experience in marketing and technology, helping startups, Fortune 500, retailers, and municipalities. And she provides strategic and hands-on training on social media, brand storytelling, and standout content, and thinking like the customer. And this is really the holy grail. How can we wear the hat of the customer and tell compelling stories? So with that, welcome to the Visual Storytelling Today show, Diana.
Thank you, Shlomi. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here, even if I'm not on your end.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Yeah,
soon, maybe soon.
Yeah, we definitely should plan an in-person meeting.
That would be great.
Yeah,
happy to be here. Happy to talk about my passion.
Excellent. Yeah, and I know Diana. Like anybody that is following what's going out there, I'm following a variety of podcasts, and I came across one of her interviews. And I think it was a brand storytelling, an Australian podcast, which was kind of really caught my attention. And I thought it could be fantastic to bring her to our show, and so she could share her wisdoms, because she started with storytelling way, way before the craze started.
Before it was called storytelling.
Exactly. So with that, maybe why don't you tell our audience a little bit about what is your backstory with business storytelling? I know that you had some tremendous work with Orange France over 10 years ago, so with storytelling. So maybe walk us through that.
Thank you, Shlomi. I'd love to. I'm part of the internet bubble generation. So I started working in e-marketing. That's how we called it at the time. And yes, we did have to tell stories in order to engage with the customers who were not used to browsing websites. So instead of having a brochure, we thought of personas and told the story of personas within consumption, within context of consuming a product. Right. But it was mostly a sales pitch, a sales technique, which it wasn't really thought out as story. And but it was my first contact with the technique. And then I really got an awakening when I started, I was still in Canada at the time, working in CRM projects. And we had a big challenge with CRM systems. We couldn't successfully implement them. And I realized why. The reason is because we never explained to the teams why we're doing this. From the front line to, the entire value chain was not in the project. So we had trouble having everyone excited, and they lacked the story. They lacked the reasons why we were all of a sudden putting lots of focus on CRM. And that aha moment happened right before I was leaving for France and started working for Orange. So I said, you know what? I think I'm going to try to explore the why a little further and in my own projects.
Yeah, starts with the why, right?
It starts with, and not the letter, but W-H-Y, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So as you were kind of starting pretty much to, pave your journey with storytelling in the early days,
yes,
and the tremendous work that you've done since then. So one of the common question we ask our speakers is, how would you define visual storytelling? So I'm kind of curious because you've gone a long way since you started. So I'm sure you have, developed your own definition by now.
Well, actually, I never really put both together in the same definition, visual storytelling. And I tend to go with your own definition, Shlomi.
Okay. I'm flattered.
Absolutely. Let's keep it simple. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's a visual narrative. So you have to be able to tell a story without using words. If you can do that, if you can be good at visually compelling story without using words, you've nailed it. Words are an extra. I think they're just and I think that we need more visual storytelling more than ever, because what we do is during the day is we are multitasking,
right?
And we can't always listen to the story as we're doing something else. However, we can have visual contact with the story.
Absolutely.
So if the narrative written is as good quality as the visual narrative, we've done well.
Right. So and I'm just going to remind the audience, the viewers and listeners, that you mentioned our definition. Our definition about visual storytelling is simply a new. Well, it's been with us for a while, but now it's gained some traction. It's basically a marketing strategy that has three components. One is that you put that you use the 3-act story structure, the setting, conflict, resolution. 2, that you put your customer as the hero of the story. So it's not about the brand is just the guide. And 3, that you use a visual medium to communicate it through. And that's our working definition to get people understand what is it, because we found, I'm wondering if you are seeing this with your clients, when you tell them that, especially marketers, story is a 3-act structure, setting, conflict, resolution, for a lot of people is a major revelation.
Yeah, and it's been around since Aristotle. So
yeah,
it's just that we've never, well, I mean, if you want to get right into it, I'd be happy to. I define a 5-step approach, and it's not visual or not visual, it's storytelling. It's a 5-step approach.
Yeah.
And before describing it, let me just say one thing about that approach. It solicits aptitudes that you don't use ordinarily in your business day.
Right.
So that's why it seems new, because we're not trained that way.
Right.
We're wired to listen to stories, however. We all are wired to listen to stories. We love the comfortable setting of a story, but we're not wired to create them.
That's an important point.
Yes. And that's the entire education that you mentioned, Shlomi, about educating them on how to become wired. Now, if I tell you the 5-step approach, you'll understand that you don't gain the aptitudes to create this overnight. It takes time.
Right.
So the step 1 is first to describe your persona. And the persona will be the main character of your story.
Yep.
And most of the time, who is the persona? It's the client, right?
Yep.
And by defining a persona is not as in the old marketing school, which is having a socio-demographic description of your persona. That's way too easy, and we know how to do this very well by now, right?
Yep.
It goes quite a little deeper, and it will actually be more intrusive. You have to be well aware of your persona's value systems, lifestyles, motivational triggers, emotional background. I mean, name it.
And how do you get your clients to find this information?
Glad you asked. My first experiment with this consisted in sitting down with my target audience, sitting virtually physically down with my target audience, open-ended questions, somewhat structured, but not survey type questions, really open-ended, feel comfortable, lounge type of setting, We
Right.
want to instill trust, and we also want to instill stress-free environment.
Yep.
That's the best way. And I mean, it's something that I don't want to sound less humble by saying this, but I've always had an ease at speaking and conversing with people and getting the truth out.
Right. No, that's an important expertise to have.
Without torture. I precise. And I because I fundamentally, I love people. It's that has always been, I cannot not work without people.
Yep.
If I spend 3 days by myself working on a report, I will go berserk.
Yep.
I need to step out and go to a networking event, meet other like-minded so that's the first basic rule, is you have to be interested in people.
Yep.
What makes them get up in the morning? What are their tics? What are their triggers? So that's the first step, to get to know your persona from the bottom, and then go your way up that way.
And quick question, are you also doing indirect research, like checking, social, what they're talking about, or are you just focusing on the direct route?
Both. And thank you for reminding me, because that is definitely, even the workshops I build are a lot more often based on observations in Facebook groups, for example.
Right.
How do people converse? What are their issues at the moment? It's very emotional a lot of the time. You get what I call golden nuggets to nurture your narrative. Yeah. So that's the first step. The second step is that what do you call it? 3-part structure.
Focusing the conflict.
Well, first is you got to know who the audience is. Yep. That's the first thing. And then you got to create your persona, because the thing is, it's very easy to get submerged in so many characteristics of your persona that you're going to want to show all of them.
Right.
That is too much for the brain to process. So you're going to have to really highlight 2, 3, 4 tops traits and stick with those for the rest of the story.
Right.
Okay. Number 1 is visioning. I did mention that, but that is so important. The visioning by that is more of a business framework. What do I want to achieve with my story? You always need to be able to write it down. Do you want to get more sales? Do you want to get more awareness? Do you want to get buy-in from your audience to adhere to a certain policy? Please write this down. It will be your narrative that you should stick on the wall.
So these are, in other words, these would be your business objectives, basically, for the story.
For the story. Not business objective as a whole, but really
just for the story.
Absolutely. And it should be in the back, and everyone should be aware of that, made aware of that. Yep. So once you have that, you define your audience, you stick to 2, 3, 4 attributes, traits of your audience. And I mean emotional traits, intellectual traits, lifestyle traits. And then you create, like you said, the 3-part structure. And that 3-part structure, I've been hearing a lot lately, bloggers on YouTube saying, you don't need this in a story. And, I get where they're coming from, but I think they're unconsciously, they don't realize that they are themselves doing the 3-act structure.
Yeah.
But some of them do it very quickly. It's almost in one scene, but you can actually pinpoint it. It's always there.
Right.
Because that's how we're wired, and we're expecting this, So the 3-part structure is what? There's a conflict to begin with, and a conflict is not necessarily a war. It could mean that there's a gap between what you're feeling.
Yep. A gap in expectation.
An expectation.
Yep.
It could be that there's a feeling of uneasiness. There's something that you want to solve, that you want to find a solution for. And then number 2, act 2 is we have the solution. And this is how we're going to present it that will allow you to feel better. Right. And number 3 is the outcome, is everyone's everyone lives happily ever after.
It's
Now,
kind
one
of,
of those,
kind of interesting that you said that number 2 is the resolution and 3 is the outcome. I thought you typically they go hand in hand, like as a one part.
well, no, because you need to see the deployment. You need the satisfaction of seeing how
I
people
got
will
it.
benefit from the end
Got
story.
it. So basically, I use the word reward for the word outcome, but
There you
I
go.
guess that's what you mean. Yep.
That's exactly what I mean.
Yep.
And we call those in storytelling land the story spine,
Yep.
where you have once upon a time, there are 6 or 7. Once upon a time, there was a family.
Yep.
Every day they would do this. And then one day, oops, issue. Because of that, we needed to find a solution until finally that solution arrived. And then ever since that day, they've been living nice and peaceful lives.
Right.
Ever since that day is what you were saying, that reward aspect, that you absolutely need to show in order to make sure that your audience visualizes. Okay. Now, having said this, since I've used storytelling in different settings, which were not all marketing, they were less sexy, actually. There were settings where we had to implement policy or new financial standards. I didn't always have that last spine, which is ever since that day. I left it open-ended so that the teams could actually come up with how they would be feeling at the end of this. Wow. And describing them in their own words. There are certain scenes that I would leave blank just to stimulate discussion within the teams.
Absolutely.
And then that would actually feel as if they owned it.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah, that's a great strategy.
But that's only, I'm sorry to interrupt, that's only a strategy where you're in a work setting, when you're in a brainstorming session. You can't do that on advertising or when it's one-ended. You know, in one-ended, you have to finish the story.
One kind of follow-up question about the reward that you were talking about.
Yes.
Obviously, what you describe is help me picture how would I feel like using your product or service in case of success. But do you also use the other side of reward? Like what would happen if I'm not going to use your solution?
You can.
Right.
But you want to keep a positive flow to the story.
Right.
I'm not saying it's not effective. Fear can be effective.
Yeah. I know that, if you're familiar with there's a whole philosophy about inadequacy marketing that is based on fear, and that's been done forever. And now there's a switch to empowerment. So my opinion is that, showing the negative rewards is almost, you need to treat it like spices in your story. You don't want to go wild, so you create a sense of fear. It's really like seasoning that you kind of pepper here and there just to kind of get your audience to understand, what are the stakes, basically. Because
I like the metaphor, the spicy metaphor. You must cook with a lot of spices for me.
Yeah, I cook every night with a lot of spices, so you can.
I can guess that much. Yeah. Yes, you're right. But I have to say that fear is effective in certain stories where you want to sensitize on very, very hardcore facts like tobacco or alcohol. And I mean, they've used it and they will keep on using it because it is effective. Absolutely. It is effective. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were saying, in the beginning, as part of your 5-step approach, that you cover a variety of business objectives. It could be awareness, sales. Do you find it like you kind of follow the entire buyer's journey in terms of like awareness, acquisition, advocacy? Do you find that your story changes based on the stage in the buyer's journey?
Well, until now, I've used storytelling let me just tell you the context in which I used them. So
Yep.
I used it to create awareness about the company's presence on the market. That was
Mhm.
the first thing. There's no selling involved. It's just
It's
it's me.
awareness. Yep.
And it's this time it focuses. There's always a persona, which is the client,
Right.
but then you have sub characters. And when it's just to present the company newcomer and landscape, it will be about the company values,
Hmm.
okay? Less than about a solution
Right.
to the product, to the consumer. When it comes to more of the benefits of a product, yes, then it's very much zoom in
Hmm.
on the consumer characteristics. Then
Got
you
it.
also have the context where you're transforming the organization.
Mm.
And then in that case, you're focusing on workplace situations where there are areas of improvement. You bring them back to the act one and act two, and then the outcome is how everyone lives much better within the new policy.
Yep.
So it always follows that same sequence. You always have, and that's a challenge because, well, from what I saw around me, you really have to discipline yourself to comply with that structure. You are tempted
To break it.
yes, you are. And you think that, it's no big deal. It is, because you are toying with our brains.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're compromising the effectiveness of your story.
Absolutely.
So,
So after running through several contexts, like various contexts with your clients, what would you say is like the common misconception business leaders have about business storytelling and its value to change it?
well, it's the myopia, product myopia again. They think that the story is about their product.
Mm. Show the
And
product.
it's a
Yeah.
classic. It's a classic. The cartoon that the illustration that has been widely used in storytelling workshops is the dad telling a bedtime story to the kids
Hmm.
and saying, "Let me just read it to you." It really exemplifies what I'm telling you. And the brand is new and improved now with 50% more claims than the leading brand. Consumers lived happily ever after the end.
Got it.
So yes, it is a parody, but at the same time, it reflects reality. We always have to, we always confront it with that, and that's my battle. It's my giggly battle, is always to bring them back in the persona's scheme of things and saying, okay, this is how your persona lives. And I give it when I'm presenting the approach before actually writing the story, I give a name to my persona. I create an attachment to that persona.
That's important. Yeah.
I want that persona to be on everyone's lips,
Hmm.
so that the CEO and the marketer and the business dev guy could slowly detach themselves from the
Yep.
product or the
Yeah.
service and really start saying, what would Susan think? And then it becomes, that's to me is a transformation.
It's like a presence. It's somebody I know, actually.
It's someone that, and they probably do. And by the way, they do know her, because
Right.
it's not a random description. I did base Susan on my observations internally at the
Right.
client side and also on what's being said on social. So they're very familiar with Susan, So the more we repeat about Susan's wants and ills and all that, the more they're anchoring and they're integrating that into their own mindset.
Yeah. I mean, it's like having your best friend, so you know everything about him or her, and you can expect certain behaviors from that person because you know her so closely. So absolutely, yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I'm kind of curious,
Yeah.
like anybody else that, been doing any particular task. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. Any kind of interesting failure that you experience, that you learned something really important about business storytelling, that told you, wow, this is really a revelation.
Yeah.
I need to change my something in the way I work.
Absolutely. So I think the fact that until now I've been lucky, so to speak, because I've been working as a solo artist. So
No, it's great.
Yeah, writing my own stories and then presenting them to the client, and the client tweaks it.
Mm-hmm.
But then lately, it's just been more of a team thing.
Yep.
And that's great. It's great for me because it allows me to question certain parts of my processes, and I think that's very healthy. And one thing that I really can take away of my team experiences is that you absolutely need to nail the process, explaining the process from the outset.
Right.
No bypass. You cannot bypass this step. Not allowed. It really, really, really needs to be owned by everyone. And so the 5-step that I described, from envisioning to narrative, yep, so that they could understand this is what we're working towards. And if they have any doubts, any questions, that you're there to answer their questions and discuss if they're not familiar with certain parts of it, because it is quite creative when you come to think of it, right?
Right. No, for sure. So just going back to your comment about the 5 steps, so I assume that part is really in our context, we call it the story making, because you focus on creating the story. But a typical engagement, I would assume you have a discovery where you're capturing requirements from the client, and then you move on to create the 5-step process. Is your deliverable stops at the business story, or you move on to work with other people to visualize it?
And that's part of the other failure that you're
okay.
nice transition.
Yeah, it just reminded me.
I asked to be involved until the final product. So from the story narrative to the final output. It can be illustration. I've worked with illustration. I've worked with video. I've worked with both support. So I asked to be involved, and some of the times I actually hired the videographer, yep, and then I work alongside. So my learning curve was with the videography world. It's really like we talked about this already, Shlomi. From what's in your head to how it's going to look in a video format, right? It's day and night. Yep. And that I learned the hard way. So how did I learn the hard way? Well, I'll tell you. I had my storyboard nailed. Personas were all cleanly defined. Right. The bubbles, everything, And I even had my audio requirements, backdrop requirements, everything. I really made sure that videographer can work with that. But a videographer has his own experience and his own background and his own vision and perception of things. Yeah. So now I never separate the two. I work in tandem with videographer till the end. That's interesting. Because what happened, and I'm sure lots of storytellers can relate, is I give him that nice little package deliverable, and then he goes in hibernation. Yeah. Or he films on site, and I come in. Is everything going okay? Great. I go back to what I was doing. I get the final product, and I'm in total shock. Because in my mind, that's not at all the ambiance I had envisioned, right, the scenery I had envisioned. And then I realized, hey, we have 2 backgrounds, 2 sets of experiences. And it's rich, and it's a wonderful opportunity to grow together. That's now how I see it,
Yeah, the way we kind of try to make the transition from story making to visualizing is really that we always say story making is really the output is what we call the meta story. It's really like the DNA of the brand or whoever you represent. And once you transition to the story visualizing, you're looking for mini stories that support your meta story. So it's not going to be the same story, but it's going to be supporting examples. So it could be, you know, dramatizing some event with the customers, with vendors, with partners, but it will be still within the umbrella of the meta story. So there's a connection, but I totally can relate to that because the script of a video is definitely going to be an extension of the overarching story that you are making.
Absolutely. Yeah, that has to be preserved. It has to be, it's the spinal cord, you know.
Exactly. So can you give us just a few examples maybe of great business stories, you know, clients that you work in the past or companies you work for, just to kind of paint a picture in the audience mind of what success look like?
Absolutely. Well, I can give you two of my own and two that I've seen in circulation that I found are really groundbreaking. So the first one dates back a few years, and that was envisioning a new service totally that did not exist at the time. And we were asked to produce scenes of usage. And so I was handed the requirements of what the different features of that service would look like. It was very innovative, by the way. It was like we're in the social media presence where before they even existed. So we had those lists of features that all looked really great on paper. But I said, if I'm going to use this to convince two executive committees, one in England and one in France, to invest a certain amount of money, I'm not going to make it because it's on paper, it doesn't mean a thing. So I acted up on my fantasy and I said, let's just put life to these situations. But the project doesn't exist. We'll make it exist. Create mock-ups. We'll do this. So I created 10 scenes with different montages, one for England. So we had the two-story, you know, buses, and one from France in different, at the ocean in urban setting, and really had our audiences who were senior executives, and I asked their secretaries to send me a little bit of their lifestyles. And remember the persona? Well, I had to be up to the challenge, right? So I made sure that the personas were in good rapport with their own lives, so that the engagement is probable, that they can feel compelled. And that's how I got my first break.
Oh, wow.
So I presented those stories to UK and France. The project was approved, and we went on to making the product.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And I could see it in their eyes, just like as I saw that same light in people's eyes when I was presenting situations. This time it was cartoon. The first, by the way, for the product, the service, it was video format.
I see.
And for the transformation project where we're implementing new policy, that was illustration format. They're still on my slide share and they look very old, but they're very, very recent in terms of
it's very relatable.
Of the tone, And there I would present those scenes, and some of them I would keep open-ended. And then something happened where as I was telling the stories, that were real life stories, by the way, depicting real life problems, I could see the attention just zooming in. At first, they were all a little distracted. You know, they're big groups of engineers and technicians. And then the more I got into the story, there was some tone involved. You know, it's like, I could tell that they were all concentrated on what was happening next. And at this point, I say, okay, I get it. They need this in order to start the conversation and start engaging. And then the ultimate reward, as you say, is what? Is have them integrate the new changes into their work.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
my work was that. Yeah.
This is amazing. I mean,
It is. It is.
It's like magic sometimes when you see this engagement created the way, since I'm a visual guy, you know, I always imagine like a vortex that's being created and your audience is coming through that directly to their story because they can see themselves in that story. And
it's underestimated. Yep. It's underestimated in the business world. I stress that. And one thing we have not talked about before I give another industrial example, Google example, which really was the best one to my humble opinion. The secret sauce here is not just stimulated the neurons, because that's what I've been reading a lot lately. And it's not that I disagree. And you know, some nice authors have been sensitizing the public now on, hey, you know what happens in your brain when you're listening to stories? I like hearing that. That's music to our ears. Yeah. However, it's not just the fact that it triggers neurons, because it can, but they won't have an effect. It won't have the desired outcome.
Right.
Why? Why? Because it's not memorized. And the only way to memorize a story is to be sure, to be 100% sure that you're touching the right neurons. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how do you know you're touching the right neurons? Because your persona has been well studied, has been well observed, and is a reflection of your target audience.
Right.
And it's a misconception saying, oh, because it triggers neurons, we've done well. No. That's just the beginning. It's just a surface. You have to make sure that it's the
physiological symptom. It's not really what happens. It's like, yeah.
So let me give you the example of the Google Cloud Drive to conclude. Yep. It's the story of a young dad, and hey, all of a sudden, half the population is not concerned with this story, but it's the young dad, and it hit young dad working in an ad agency. Whoop, we're just targeting even more. He's been addictively taking photos of his newborn, and like we can all relate. And at one point, he forgets his phone in the cab. So you can see the conflict happening, and there's music, also a backdrop. Everything was perfectly orchestrated. And then he comes home, realizes the phone is missing, and panic sets in. Perfectly translated, by the way. I mean, they had a crew probably analyzing how to set in panic in 2.5 seconds.
Yeah.
It was magic.
Challenge.
And then someone reminds him that he had Google Drive, Google Photos. And it was all solved because he could find his entire album. It wasn't the phone. The issue wasn't the phone. It was the photos. And that's who they were talking to.
Right. So it's kind of real life examples that everybody can relate to. And the technology solution is really part of the story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's the new dad working in an urban setting. There are many of those in circulation right now in their 30s, you know. It's not a minority. So they were actually very clever in targeting that profile specifically. Not the hipster going out in the bar. No. The young dad who is still in an urban setting. So that to me is one of the best scenarios depicting the 3-act story.
Absolutely. And we keep preaching in our workshops, basically, that how do you know your story is successful is the moment it stops becoming your story and becoming your audience story. Because they can say, hey, that's me in that story. You're talking about my story, my pain point. And that's where the transition become, and it stops becoming an ad and becomes like a personal story that can
absolutely you own it.
Yep.
You own it. You become, and the KPI for this is what? The KPI is that person listening will be the ambassador.
Yeah.
To every other dad in their environment.
Yeah.
You see this ad. Do you have Google Photo? You should get your Google Photo.
Yeah.
I'll send you the link to YouTube. You'll understand why. That's your best KPI.
Exactly. And speaking about KPIs, do you typically measure your success or ask to provide some success criteria?
I want to be involved in that. Yes,
Uh-huh.
it can be the number of subscriptions, it can be the sales flow, it can be the leads,
Right.
it can be the number of people integrating new policy. So it takes a few weeks,
Sure.
months in order to be able to do a cause and effect,
Got it.
like a solid cause and effect relationship. So you don't get out of the contract right away once you've delivered the story. Stick around
Absolutely.
and ask to be involved in those dashboard meetings if you can.
Because then you have case studies that fuel your next client. That's another thing it's important to consider.
But
So
not every client's the same. Some will be will be open to that. Others will say no, thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And sometimes, the data is super sensitive. So that's another
Exactly.
thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So obviously, you've gone a very long journey with storytelling. So any predictions to what's going to happen next, the future of business storytelling, when you look at the technology changing in front of us, all the rage about fake news right now.
Yeah, well, I think there's one futuristic trend that's already deploying today is
Mm-hmm.
people are becoming increasingly aware, self-aware.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a criteria. If you want to start telling stories in your business, you have to be self-aware. You have to be open to context and to others.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds very philosophical, but it shows right away when that mindset is already present within the business. If you think that you know everything about the customer before starting the storytelling, I can assure you most of the time it's not the case. You really have to take the measure of what's around you. Okay, what context are we in? How is our customer feeling at this point? Are there any threats in the horizon? Be aware that these are core ingredients to good story.
That's going to stick around for the foreseeable future. In order to create a good story, you always need to get to the bottom of your persona and get awareness to the contextual challenges. Yeah.
And you also have to be willing to be transparent, certain authenticity, let go a little bit of that marketing world that we oh so dearly love, because now people expect it. They expect
some vulnerability and imperfections.
Yes,
all that.
yes. And lastly, make it always about the other, less about you. Always about the other. By ricochet, it will be about you, but make it about your client. It's like I say, you have to keep on repeating that. That to me is the futurist immediate trend that us storytellers need to continue disseminating. Okay.
Absolutely.
And number two, for the to bring it back to technology, I think what's going on right now is really interesting. I've seen, I think it was a TED Talk, someone from BBC who was talking about, let me just give you the right terms, visual perception and future narrative. So what he's been saying is that we're cutting stories now in bits, little bits. And from those little bits, we are adapting them to setting.
Yeah.
So it's like a mashable of sorts. And it's very interesting. And for example, you have this great narrative, it's effective, but you also know that you can use it in different contexts. Are you going to use the same backdrop, the same audio, the same clothes, according to if you're at the airport versus the train station versus your home? Perhaps not. And we all know that we're sensitive. We have different senses, right? And that would be interesting if technology allows us to adapt the different bits according to context.
Absolutely. So you threw a ton of tips to our audience, but if you need to kind of narrow it down to 3, which one would you say? Somebody who want to get started with business storytelling, your top 3
Okay.
tips.
So first is be more aware of the motivational triggers of the human being.
Yep.
Okay. That is fundamental. When you decide to go storytelling, let everyone know within the organization.
So you have a full buy-in from everybody.
Don't make it a silo. That's number 1 trap. Explain what storytelling is and let everyone know that you'll be mapping out a project around that. It's a pilot and we want everyone in.
That's very
Number three, I would say, depending on the size of your company, be familiar with filmography techniques. Not become an expert, just be familiar with the trends. I know that I've learned a great deal working hand in hand with my videographer. And I remember when I was first started working in the web marketing, I took 6 months of JavaScript just to understand coding and also to be able to discuss with the coder. So it's a little the same principle, you know, don't disconnect from the final result and how you get there.
Yeah. No, these are all great tips and cannot agree more with your suggestions. I every day in our work. So yeah, so I want to thank you so much for, you know, sharing so much great advice and wisdoms about storytelling.
Yeah,
and
I'm so happy.
For our audience who want to contact with you, how can they do that?
Okay, right now they can go through my Facebook page at DFY Consulting.
Okay.
DF like for Ferdinand.
Or Frank, yeah.
Frank.
Usual Frank always standing for F.
For some reason, I wanted it more theatrical.
Yeah.
And Y for Yazidjian, my last name, consulting.
Got it.
Or I'm also on Twitter. They could message me, follow me there. I'd be happy. Just keep on following me wherever you are, so we could stay in touch. And there's always LinkedIn at Diana Yazidjian, where you can connect with me there.
Awesome. So thank you again. And for you, the audience, you know, we're going to obviously create a show notes with all the great information that Diana shared with us today, including some of the visual examples she talked about. And as you know, don't let the market write the story for you. Take control and own your story. See you next time. Thank you.
Take care.